Shalom, everyone. We are approaching the Redemptive of Pesach, and we know that Pesach, there is a mitzvah from the Torah that the first night of Pesach and in Chutz La'aretz, first 2 nights, we have a whole ceremony called the Seder, and the cornerstone of the Seder is the recitation of the Haggadah. But the single most important part of the Haggadah is towards the end of the Magid, before the second cup. And this is a statement of Rabban Gamliel that anyone that does not explain the 3 commandments of Pesach, eating the paschal lamb, matzah, eating matzah, maror, and eating the bitter herbs, lo yatsa yedei chovaso, has not fulfilled his obligation to talk about Yitziat Mitzrayim. Meaning, even if I discuss the 10 plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea and all of the miracles, I do not fulfill the mitzvah of Haggadah unless I explain the significance of Pesach, matzah, and maror. Why is that so important? Yes, I have to eat the matzah, but why do I have to talk about it? After all, when I take lulav and esrog, I don't have to explain the meaning of lulav and esrog. When I hear the shofar, I don't have to explain the meaning of shofar. But when it comes to Pesach, when it comes to the Seder, when it comes to the Haggadah, the mitzvah of recounting the Exodus, it is essential to the mitzvah itself that I talk about Pesach, matzah, maror. Why is that so? So to answer this question, let's explore another question. There's another passage in the Haggadah that is also taken from the Mishnah in Pesachim, that chayav adam liros es atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. Every person must regard themselves as if they were personally liberated from Mitzrayim. Yitziat Mitzrayim is not simply commemorative. We don't simply remember what it was that Hashem did for our forefathers, but we have to imagine ourselves as if we ourselves were liberated. Now, don't confuse this with an earlier idea in the Haggadah. Earlier, the Haggadah said that if God had not redeemed our forefathers, we might have been assimilated, we might have been slaves. But that's not saying I personally experienced redemption. That's saying I am grateful for what Hashem did for my ancestors. That is what the Seder says at the beginning. But at this point, it's making a much more dramatic claim. It is not simply gratitude for what God did to my ancestors, but there has to be mamash, a feeling as if I myself was redeemed from Mitzrayim. Now, what does that even mean? After all, I was never in Mitzrayim. I was never in Egypt. I certainly was not a slave in Egypt. So in what way can it be said it's as if I experienced redemption? So let me offer 2 explanations. One is a relatively simple, straightforward explanation. The other is a bit more complex. The straightforward explanation is actually offered by the Rambam. The Rambam simply says that the idea is we harness the power of imagination, meaning it is human nature that we don't appreciate a blessing until we experience the opposite of that blessing. A person might not experience health or the blessings of good health until, God forbid, they face illness. Those of us who have parents or grandparents who survived the Holocaust or came from repressive environments like the former Soviet Union, they appreciate the blessings of freedom and liberty, much more so than those of us who had the privilege of being born into freedom and liberty. So if it's true that you don't appreciate freedom unless you've experienced oppression and slavery, you don't appreciate health until you've experienced illness. So in order for me to have gratitude to God for the gift of freedom and liberation, I have to imagine what it is like to be a slave. I have to imagine the torture, the pain, the degradation, the humiliation. And therefore what you're doing is you're harnessing the power of imagination to generate within your personality feelings of gratitude. So according to this, the statement that each person must regard himself as if they were liberated from Mitzrayim is not expressing an actual factual truth. I was not in Mitzrayim, I was not liberated from Mitzrayim, but it's using the imaginative faculty to imagine yourself as a slave. So you will have hakarat hatov for all that God has given you. That is interpretation number one, similar lahavdil to method acting, in which the actor puts himself in the situation so he can experience the fullness of emotions that the scene calls for. And indeed, Rav Chatzkel Levenstein, the great Musar Mashgiach, said, a Baal Musar must have a powerful visual imagination to be able to experience the pivotal events of God's divine providence, whether it's experiencing the Exodus or the giving of the Torah or the splitting of the Red Sea. That is explanation number one. Explanation number two is Kabbalistic, and I'll just mention it briefly, and that is, even though I myself, as a conscious individual, did not experience servitude in Egypt, but it is said that all of the souls of the Jewish people, those that were already born and those that would be born in the future, did experience that servitude. So in a very literal sense, my neshama was enslaved in Mitzrayim and was liberated. That's explanation number two. But explanation number three, which is the thing I want to focus on, is from the Baal Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he explains that the word Mitzrayim has a double meaning. Mitzrayim does mean Egypt, and of course we believe that the Jewish people were physically enslaved by the ancient Egyptian empire from which God liberated us. That's very true. But Mitzrayim also has another connotation of boundaries, limitations, constraints, blockages. David HaMelech says in Hallel, Min ha-meitzar karasika, I call out to God from the narrow, confining places. Anani b'merchav, answer me with expansiveness. So Mitzrayim means Egypt, but Mitzrayim also means blockages and constriction. So says the Baal Tanya, in that light, every single Jew has their own inner Mitzrayim. You can have the Mitzrayim, anything that blocks me in my connection to God. I can have the Mitzrayim of anger, the Mitzrayim of egotism, the Mitzrayim of selfishness, laziness, despair, depression, self-loathing, resentment. All of these things are an inner Mitzrayim that enslave me and block me and prevent me from connecting to God. And as the saying goes, it might be easier to take the Jew out of Mitzrayim than it is to take Mitzrayim out of the Jew. So says the Baal Tanya, when God took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, he put into the world a spiritual force in which I can grab onto that koach of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and I can become liberated from all of the Mitzrayims that enslave me. So when the Haggadah says, each person must regard themselves as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, it doesn't mean Each person must imagine they were in Egypt and they were enslaved. That didn't happen. Historically, that's not correct. But the inner meaning is, each person must identify their own Mitzrayim. And by identifying my own Mitzrayim, I then can latch on to the power of Yetziat Mitzrayim and become liberated from the constraints and constrictions and blockages that prevent me from connecting to God. So that would mean that every aspect of the Haggadah has a double meaning. The simple basic meaning is the narrative of the Jewish nation, how we were slaves, and God liberated us, and God gave us a Torah. This is the history and foundation of our identity in our relationship to God. And every year, countless Jews, even Jews who are not necessarily so observant, want to share that story and communicate that story. And that is the common narrative that unites Jews everywhere in the world. That is one level. Mitzrayim as Egypt, the story of the liberation of the Jewish nation from Egypt. That is what we would call the common narrative that is shared by all Jews. But in addition, there's a second aspect to the Haggadah, which is idiosyncratic, private, and personal. Each person has their own Mitzrayims, their own blockages, their own constrictions, and each person needs to be liberated from that. And on the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim, on the holiday of Pesach, God gives us the strength and the inspiration and the wherewithal to be liberated from our personal demons and enslavers. Double meaning. General meaning applicable to everybody. Personal meaning, which will differ from individual to individual as we identify our own Mitzrayims and we seek to be liberated, to be made free. Let's go back now to Pesach Matzah Maror. We began with the question of why is it so important to talk about Pesach Matzah Maror. One might suggest that Pesach Matzah Maror are three tools that God has given us to become liberated from our own inner Mitzrayim. Let me start in reverse order. I'll explain why. Let me start with Maror. What is Maror? Maror is eating bitter herbs to remember the slavery, remember the affliction, remember the suffering. How does that link to my personal Mitzrayim? And the lesson is, the very first step you must take to be liberated from your inner slavery is to be honest enough to yourself to acknowledge the bitterness. Admit that you're a slave. Admit there are things you have to work on. If you have an anger problem, a relationship problem, a self-esteem issue, an arrogance problem, an egotism problem, be honest. Until you admit that you're a slave, there is no way you can ever become free. Until you acknowledge that you're lost, it is impossible to make any effort to get on the right path. You have to first admit you're on the wrong path. Sweeping matters under the rug may seemingly work in the short term, but all I can say is the rug is going to get higher and higher and higher till it hits the ceiling, and then there'll be no place to go. So Maror reminds me of the need to be courageous enough, to be honest enough, to acknowledge my slavery. And by that acknowledgement, I've taken the first step towards my spiritual liberation. But then we have the symbolism of matzah. Now, we know, basically on Pesach, chametz is bad, matzah is good, right? You're not allowed to have chametz, you're not allowed to have anything that fermented, anything that rises. The symbolism of chametz and matzah is very varied. Some say chametz is puffed up, it represents arrogance and gaiva. Matzah is flat, it represents humility. That is one interpretation. But Maharal offers another interesting interpretation. And he says, chametz represents inertia. If water hits flour, you don't have to do anything for it to become chametz. You don't need yeast. You don't need a starter. If you just let it alone, if water hits flour and 18 minutes elapse, it is chametz. Chametz is what happens by itself. In order to make matzah, you must take definitive action before the 18 minutes by baking the moistened dough in an oven. Chametz is inertia. Matzah represents action. And here is the relationship between moror and matzah. Moror is to cognitively identify what my slavery is. But there are people that have great insight. They've been in therapy for many, many years. They understand every single problem they have going back to birth and maybe even pre-birth traumas, preconception traumas, if there's such a thing. But they don't do anything about it. They don't take action. They become aware and more aware and more aware and stew in their self-awareness. Matzah is a reminder that it's not enough to identify problems. You got to take action. You know, they tell the story about Robert Hutchins, who was a famous American academic, and he was president of the University of Chicago as a young man. And at one point, someone asked him, Professor Hutchins, why don't you ever exercise? Do you ever feel like exercising? And he responded, every once in a while I do, but I know if I just lie down and wait a few minutes, the feeling will pass. So I don't let it bother me. This is true for exercise, but it's also true for spiritual growth. Quite often we might get moments of inspiration. It might be after Yom Kippur, it might be after a Pesach Seder. It might be at the wedding of a child or a grandchild. It might be just walking the streets of Yerushalayim and seeing children playing. There are moments of inspiration, moments of Kedusha, moments of emotional arousal. But if we don't concretize the moment in some type of virtuous action, the emotion dissipates and passes. But if you concretize it in a virtuous action, even if it's small, I learn Torah for 5 minutes, I say a chapter of Tehillim, I give tzedakah, I greet a person with a pleasant countenance, then Chazal teach us, mitzvah gereres mitzvah. One mitzvah causes another mitzvah, and you get stronger and stronger. So maror is the awareness of my slavery. Matzah is the commitment to definitive and virtuous action, because only that way will my inspiration be concretized. Then we come to Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, which unfortunately, in the absence of a Beis HaMikdash, is the one ritual we cannot yet do today. And the Korban Pesach has many halachot, but I want to mention one halacha in particular, which is an argument in the Gemara, but this is how we paskin. And that is, Ein shochtin es ha-Pesach ala yochid. A Korban Pesach cannot be brought by one person. I either bring it with my family, or if I don't have a family, I join up with other people and I bring it as part of a group. Even if you have a very big appetite and you have a very small lamb, and you could finish the whole Korban Pesach by yourself, you're not allowed to bring it by yourself. You must bring it with others. And the lesson here is fairly clear. In order to achieve liberation from our Mitzrayim, we can't do it alone. We need to connect to others who share our values and share our journey. Whether it's husband and wife, parent and children, chaverim in a yeshiva, fellow mispalalim in a shul. Some of these, or all of these, we need to be connected. Without that connection, we can't do it by ourselves. Shlomo HaMelech says in Koheles, Tovim Hashnayim Enohecha, two is better than one, because if you have two people and one falls, Hoechad Yokim et Chaveiro, one person can help the other person stand up. But if one is by himself and he falls, who will help him? Shlomo HaMelech is not only talking about ice, he's talking about life. There are times that I'm weak. There are times I'm not inspired. But my friend, spouse, chavrusa, whatever, can give me chizuk. And there are times that they are weak, and I can give them chizuk. So Pesach Matzah Maror. Maror, honestly acknowledge your slavery. Matzah, do something about it. Pesach, find a community in which each of you can help the other. And this is how we emerge from our private Mitzrayim to achieve freedom. One final point. In the Seder, we first eat the matzah, then we eat the maror. Now one might ask a question. If maror is identifying the problem and matzah is doing something about the problem, how can I do something about a problem before I've identified what the problem is? So why do I first eat matzah and then eat maror? Logically, I should first eat maror and then eat matzah. And the answer I would suggest is this. It is true that I can't really take action to address a problem until I become aware of what the problem is. So sequentially, the maror gives me the identification, and the matzah teaches me to take action. But psychologically, I need to internalize the lesson of matzah before I internalize the maror. Because if I start with my chesaron, if I start with my failures, if I start with my inadequacies, my enslavements, my Mitzrayim, what is likely to happen is I will get depressed, I will get despondent, I will be hopeless and feel helpless, and then I'll be paralyzed and unable to go on. The lesson of matzah teaches me I can take action. I can change. I can improve. I can grow. Only after I've internalized that lesson am I then ready to look at my inner slavery. So I need the lesson of matzah in order to face the maror. And then, after I have eaten the matzah, which is the possibility of change, and then I eat the maror, which is the recognition of my inner Mitzrayim, I then eat the matzah and the maror together. I have a problem and I have a solution, and I can work on them at the same time. Once I know the problem, I have the solution of the matzah. So the idea here basically is that Mitzrayim is a double slavery, the historical slavery of Egypt, and the inner Mitzrayim of our lives, and the story of the Exodus of Egypt can become the story of the freedom that we can get from our own inner Mitzrayim. I wish everyone a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. Chazal say, B'Nisan nigalu, in Nisan we were redeemed, u'b'Nisan asidin ligoyel, and in Nisan the future redemption will occur as well. May all of us merit this. A good Redemptive.
Hi, this is Peretz Baruch Eichler, a proud alumnus of Ohr Somayach. Now what you just watched is one of the many programs that Ohr Somayach provides, leaving its impact on hundreds of thousands, with so many more waiting to be reached. Ohr Somayach's central campus in Jerusalem has over 300 students presently learning there. And now you can be a vital part of spreading that bounty of knowledge worldwide by logging on to donate.ohr.edu. We can step up to the plate at this pivotal moment of Ohr Somayach's growth and bring the next generation of Jews home.